Okay. Good morning. I hope we're live. I think we're live. We have our chat feature going, so feel free to say good morning. Tell us who is online, where you are this morning. We're so happy that you've joined us today. Oh, before we get started, I want to let you know that we have a couple of business things coming up. In December, on December the 10th, we have two things going on that you'll be interested in. Number one is our procrastinators sessions for your learning units. We'll be offering 4 that day. We are working around, CSI is also doing, if you remember, they're doing the 12 days of the holidays. And so they have a session at 3. I don't remember exactly what time, but we're working around that. So you have an option on the 10th of December to actually get 5 LUs if you need them. We are offering 4. More details on the website upcoming, so be aware of that. Number 2, in terms of business, we have proposed some updated bylaws, and we will have that posted here shortly. So be sure and take a look at that. And then you as members will be voting with us on the 10th at our business meeting before we start our noontime session for procrastinators. So a couple things of business coming up. Be sure and join us. Reach out if you've got any questions, and I'm happy to have you. This morning, we're super excited to have Thad Goodman presenting. He is, I swear, I think that Thad knows everybody. I don't think I've ever met anybody, especially in the Midwest, that does not know Thad. We're so lucky to have him and his time today. He is with National Gypsum, of course, and he's the construction design manager. Thad, how long have you been with National Gypsum?
I've been with National 12 years.
12 years. Okay. Well, that is, we're so happy to have you present today. Of the many topics that you could present on, we really felt like, and maybe it's because of a few of us behind the scenes are grumbling about control joints and what do we do about control joints, and it seems like we're having some problems with that. And so he's kind enough to restructure his presentation for us today on control joints. He wants any questions, all questions, post them. We'll take a look at them and ask them as we can throughout the morning. So with that, Thad, thanks for being here, and take it away.
Thank you, Stacy. That's wonderful. I appreciate the opportunity to present. A little disclaimer. You're exactly right. This presentation is not a National Gypsum sponsored program. I work for National Gypsum. I'm involved in that. This is actually going to be accredited through the CSI organization, CSINext chapter. And Daniel was good enough. Daniel Hargreaves is our guru of all things. And he's the one that submits these. So you'll get your credit. We'll send out certificates when this is over. I put this together for an architectural firm who had some questions, and it was met with such success that I felt like this was one that I offered to the firm, to the chapter, and said, okay, let's go ahead. If we can get it accredited, let's go ahead and put it together. And we've gotten some really good registration activity. And so I'm looking forward to presenting this to you folks. If you have questions, feel free to ask. If we don't get to everything that we need, I can send follow-up emails afterwards. So with that, I'm going to do my best to cut my video just to see if I can give me a little more bandwidth. So hang on a minute while I try to figure that out. Again, technically, I could be in trouble here. All right. That being said, we'll start with control joints in gypsum wallboard assembly systems. All right. First of all, what is a control joint? A control joint is a specified space to help alleviate tension in a building, right? Basically, you'll understand a little more about this as we go on. But gypsum is a product that needs to have a little relief, and we'll talk about why. There's a picture of one here from the Gypsum Association. This is kind of what we're looking for. This is what we're going to do when we get it all together. There are various kinds of control joints. There are control joints that are fire rated. There are control joints that are not fire rated. There are control joints that go all the way through the wall. There are control joints that are only on one side of the wall. So you have variations. You have options of what you need to do. You have options of the things that you can do. And so this adds to some of the confusion that I see when I'm talking to people as they say, okay, I need a fire-rated control joint. I've seen one from one side of the wall, like the one on the left-hand side on the bottom of this picture. I'm not sure exactly how to make this fire-rated. So we've got some systems here, and we'll show some resources at the end to give you an opportunity to know where to find this information once we get past it. So the purpose of control joints, basically, from a gypsum perspective, control joints are meant to control cracking. And again, hopefully you can see my mouse in this picture. If not, you may be able to see that thin pencil line going up this vaulted ceiling area. This is what we're trying to stop. This is the issue that we see on a regular basis. And we'll also spend some time talking about what a stress joint is as opposed to an expansion joint and a control joint. So you'll have an opportunity to see all of these things. Now, for the next 3 slides, I'm going to get a little technical on you. We're going to do a little geek talk. And I will tell you, Stacy asked me how long I'd been at National Gypsum, 12 years. Prior to that, I was with a company called Quiet Rock for 6 years. Prior to that, I was with a company called Georgia Pacific Gypsum for 14 years. Prior to that, I was a drywall contractor. So I grew up in the drywall business. I'm just a dumb drywall guy. And basically what I'm telling you is I must not be able to keep a job because I just keep changing around. But basically, I get kind of geeked up about this stuff, okay? So we'll spend a little time talking about the fact that there are 2 physical types of influences that control gypsum: thermal expansion and hydrometric expansion. And so thermal expansion occurs when a material is exposed to heat. And so when we think about, okay, how the temperature rises, the temperature falls, I own a house that was built in 1860. We have one area where the sun comes in on a wood floor, and even today, even last night, you could hear it crack. As it expands, the wood gets hot, expands, and then it cools off and it starts to crack a little bit. So things move, buildings move forever. So if we think about a solid object, thermal coefficient of linear expansion, linearly, it's going to move and it's going to grow. We'll call that TCLE, just for short. This happens when materials absorb moisture, and there is moisture inside of drywall. Typical drywall is a rock. Gypsum is made up of a rock. Gypsum is a rock. Drywall is made up of that rock. CaSO4, 2H2O, calcium sulfate dihydrate. So in a typical 5/8 4x12 piece of drywall, there's about 22 pounds of chemical water sitting there in that board, acting like a silent sentry waiting for a fire. And that's exactly why it's so efficient, and we use it in fire-rated assemblies. So this product is going to move a little bit. So gypsum board has thermal and hydrometric expansion characteristics. It has a TLC of 9 times 10.6 inches and an HCE of 7.10.6 inches. And basically what that means, if you look at that, the gypsum board will expand a little tiny bit when the temperature of board is increased. That little tiny bit is where we have the problem. So we need to give it some relief. I put a link down there. When we put this online, you'll be able to go to that link if you want. I can send it so you can record this for later if you want. So what happens is the drywall is going to move enough that it's going to create a problem if we don't give it some relief. So we do get questions about what's a control joint versus an expansion joint. Oftentimes when I'm talking to an architectural firm, they really are talking about an expansion joint, but when they approach me, they ask about a control joint issue. And as we get farther into it, we see there's maybe some confusion for one or the other. So control joints are designed to manage the shrinkage, or that little tiny bit that we talked about that drywall is going to move. Expansion joints are designed to control a building that's going to move. So we have major movement in that building, and we need to allow for that. And there's places where that makes total sense. Now you can have a control joint that also acts as an expansion joint, but you really shouldn't have an expansion joint that acts as a control joint because you've overbuilt the system if that's the case. So again, let's get a little deeper into that. Purpose of a control joint is to control cracks. The purpose of an expansion joint is to accommodate movement in a building. So the movement in a control joint is very, very minor, just a little bit. Movement in a building, much bigger. We've got bigger issues than just the drywall where that's concerned. The control joint is just specifically for that particular product. As we think about how it's going to expand and contract, the expansion joint is more about how the building is going to move. So installation is relatively easy. For one, a control joint can be cut in later, a little bit of work, but we can make it happen if we have to. Installation on an expansion joint, that's designed by the building team, and the engineers and the architects do what they need to do and they go from there. So absolutely two totally different things. And as you can see on the right-hand column with expansion joints, if you just used a control joint to try to handle everything on the right side of the screen, you're going to be in trouble. If you add in a control joint while you're doing the part on the right hand of the screen, you're going to be fine. So again, that's where some of the confusion happens. So who owns control joints? Ooh, this is why I get so many questions. This is why I have so many problems when we're talking to people. And typically when somebody calls me, we're already in the middle of a job site or the job site is over and we're having some issues. Control joints, ASTM C840. This is a resource that every one of you probably has in your 3-part spec. I don't know that I've ever seen a Division 9 spec without it listed as one of the requirements. Control joints shall be installed where indicated on the plans. So those of you on the call, there might be contractors, there might be consultants, there might be architects here on the call. Those of you that are architects need to understand that if you do not show a control joint, the contractor cannot be expected to put them in. Basically, the Technical Services Information Bureau, the TSIB, actually goes as far as saying if control joints are referenced in the specifications but not indicated on the construction drawings, the anticipated quality for the contractor is 0. Now, just in case you haven't read C840, because that's one of those things you have to pay for, the GA 216, the Gypsum Association Document 216, Application and Finishing of Drywall Gypsum Products, has similar language involved, and I will be happy to send that to anybody on the call that requests it. So understand, from an architectural perspective, we're in the driver's seat. And if we do what we want to do correctly, everything goes according to plan. Sometimes the specifications say put in control joints per Gypsum Association documents referenced in part 1 of your spec, which is fantastic. But then you have the issue where the contractor says, okay, I know they have to go in. I'm going to decide where to put them. And that's when things go awry. So the Gypsum Association also has a document that basically gives some direction to what you need to have them in. An interior wall or partition that runs uninterrupted in a straight plane anywhere past 30 feet should have a control joint. You know how we talked about that little tiny bit that it expands and contracts? If we get past that 30 feet, as it expands and contracts, it's going to create relief. The building will tell you where the stress is. The wall will tell you where the stress is if you don't give it relief where you should. Now that 30 feet is an approximate. I get questions from people saying, hey, I've got one that's 26 feet or 29 feet and 10 inches. I've got one that's 31 feet and 1 inch. Am I okay? Yes. That's basically kind of the major guideline. You're towards the end of that when you get to that 30 feet. That 30 feet is something where we say, okay, this is where we want it. This is the optimum place where we want it to be. Let's see if we can make sure that we get it where we want it. Now, interior partitions with perimeter relief, and again, perimeter relief is making sure that we can breathe, the building can breathe. That area can have some little sort of flexibility. Control joints not to exceed 50 feet in a total area. Think about a carport outside a hotel or somewhere like that, or a big assembly area in a convention center. So if we have perimeter relief, if you're sitting a wall on top of if you're sitting a ceiling on top of a vertical wall and has a chance to expand and contract naturally, we can go a little farther. For interior ceilings without relief, again, we need to make sure we stay within that 30 feet. Exterior soffits and control joints, basically we want to have around 30 feet. Exterior soffits. Exterior soffits are a little different because now we've got wind load issues, we've got concerns there, we've got temperature variations that are bigger than you'd have inside. So that's the difference between the 50 feet and the 30 feet. So there's some general instructions. If you think about the fact that we're trying to create relief, you really don't need a control joint at an outside corner. Okay. That corner is the natural relief. You're going to have some expansion and contraction opportunities there. Even if you've got a piece of corner bead nailed to it, it's going to be able to breathe just enough to get you past where you need to be. And then a control joint shall be installed where a partition, wall, ceiling traverses a construction joint. Anytime you start to change framing directions, you have an opportunity to start to restrict one side of that board from the other. And that's when you should think about putting a control joint in. We'll show some examples of that. Framing transitions, here's exactly what I was talking about. If you look at where these two arrows are pointed, you know, the framing came down that one hallway, it changed and came over to the other side, and then it goes back the other way. So these were all framing changes. So some sort of control joint or intermediate blocking made sense. And in this particular case, the architect decided to make them control joints. So they did exactly what they were supposed to do here. They changed the direction of the framing. They provided relief for that gypsum. It says in the GA 234, the document we referenced earlier, that control joints can be used as a design accent. Control joints can be installed anywhere if they want to. If the architect feels like they're going to add aesthetically to the wall design, you can do them. Now, this was a large wall. It was about 50 feet tall and it was about 40 feet wide. They were going to have to put control joints in this area anyway. But in this particular case, they decided to add some extra ones to give it a little bit of a look, to give it more of a designed look. So the architect has that opportunity. You don't have to be at 30 foot. You could be at 10 foot, 10 foot, 10 foot, wherever you wanted to make it look the way you wanted it to look. Sometimes we see control joints hidden in the basis of this. In this particular wall, there had to be a control joint or two. They decided to put several in and make it part of the design of the wall. So some additional general constructions. These are questions that we get on a regular basis. Can you just cut a control joint in anywhere in the wall and cantilever board in between the studs? And the answer is no. You should provide separate supports for each of the control joint flanges. Each side of that opening should have some sort of support. Now, occasionally, I see that not done. In retrospect, people say, all right, we've already made a mistake. We've already got a situation where we don't have a control joint. We're going to provide some relief because we have a crack in the wall anyway. And then if we can get by with it, if it lasts long enough, if the gypsum is like a 5/8 product that's relatively stiff in a structural wall, and we're not going to get a lot of movement other than that, we may be able to just cut in a one-sided control joint on one side of the wall. We're going to take a chance realizing that down the road, we may have to go in and do further repairs, but we're going to put a Band-Aid on it first and see what happens. Now, let me say something that the Gypsum Association and my company probably won't be thrilled about. I have seen that happen. Oh, I have seen that happen, and I have seen it last for decades. It's not correct. It's not anything anybody's going to write you a letter on. It's not something we approve, but it does happen, and it does make sense occasionally. So just know that that option is out there. And my job in this presentation is to give you the good and the bad and the ugly. So if you have fire ratings, we will talk a little bit about the fire rated joint. We'll send you a list of how that works. Leave a continuous gap in the surface to be able to put things in. Understand that ceiling height door frames are basically a control joint all by themselves. And then control joints, door frames of lesser heights, the recommendation is that you would put a control joint at both sides of that door opening. Think about the fact that you're going to, especially heavier doors, you're going to get movement on both sides of that assembly. But if you decide to only use one, then use the jam side. You want as much support as you can get. You want as little movement there where that control joint is as possible. So if you can only use one, provide it at the jam side. Here's a good example of how that was done, where then these particular doors, This was a hallway where there were several different door openings. They decided to go with one control joint and they put it on the jamb side, which is exactly how they should have done it, as opposed to putting vertical control joints at the top of each one of these door openings. So some other control joint common questions. Do gypsum manufacturers have a strong opinion about zinc versus vinyl control joints? Understand both of them are out there. There's metal control joints, there's zinc, there's vinyl, there's several. And the answer is no. From a manufacturing perspective, from a gypsum association perspective, as our industry, both work well, both can be painted, both do a nice job. Do I need a control joint if I have a deflection track? And an answer, of course, is no, unless your wall exceeds 30 linear feet. The need for control joints is not dictated by the use of a deflection track. So again, when we get into some of these areas, I cover Chicago as part of my territory. We get into some of these high-rise buildings, we can have as much as an inch and a half of deflection. So there are times where we have this discussion, but as a general rule of thumb, the answer is no. You don't need a control joint if you have a deflection track. Does the gypsum board thickness have any effect on the design of the joints? In other words, is it a ½ inch? Is it a ¼ inch? Is it 3/8? Is it 5/8? Is it 3/4 inch drywall? Is it 1 inch liner? What makes the difference? And the answer is no. The design of the control joint is the same for all gypsum board, regardless of the thickness. If it's taped together, if it's put together taper to taper, and it's put over 30 lineal feet, the expansion and contraction of that is going to demand that you provide it some relief, regardless of how thick the product is. Should I install control joints on exterior gypsum sheathing? This is an interesting question. We all know that we're going to put control joints on the outside of buildings. You can't hardly drive by a big building. I was in Cleveland recently for the CSI National Conference, and I looked out my window and there's brick buildings on both sides of me. They have control joints on a regular basis. They go from the floor all the way up 5 or 6 stories to the top. That had nothing to do with the sheathing itself. The sheathing is a square edge product. Regular drywall is tapered edge, and you put it together with tape and bond it together. The sheathing, typically, if those joints are treated at all, they're treated by the building envelope manufacturer. Oftentimes those products are elastomeric and they allow for movement of their own. So there's no need to worry about a control joint for a gypsum sheathing. But the weather barrier and the cladding manufacturers may need those, and so they may dictate that they're put in from somewhere to help complete their system. So understand, while this is a question that has 2 different answers, yes, we might, no, we don't. It has nothing to do with the gypsum product itself. It's the products that are involved around it. It's the building envelope that wraps around it. Do the framing materials matter when designing control joints? This is another question that I get on a regular basis. I worked in steel. We do traditionally steel. We've moved into some multifamily situations, especially over the past decade or 15 years. We got firms that continue to branch out and do different types of work, diversify with their wood, or I've got a steel stud team and I've got a wood stud team, and we're both talking about control joints. Do they both have different requirements because these are different products? And the answer is no. The guidelines are the same for both, because the gypsum that you're putting over those products is the same product. It still has that thermal expansion that needs that relief. Is it possible to fill a control joint with acrylic caulk and paint over it to completely hide it or make it disappear? Traditionally, this is a question that comes maybe from a museum, or maybe somebody in an arts center, someone that has, where the customer is a little more in tune with what the plane is going to look like. They want to put a mural on the wall, perhaps a school system wants to put a mural on the wall, and they really don't want a control joint down the hallway to be interrupting it. Can we do that? Yes, you can. Try anything you want. If you want to, put some product in there. Go ahead and put some caulking or seal it up there as much as you can. But understand that if that ceiling or that sealant is flexible, There are times where it may move and it may create some disruption in the paint or whatever that goes over top of it. There's a possibility that sealant, if it moves enough, it'll start to bulge, or it concave or convex, it'll change over time. You're probably going to create a maintenance item for your facility management team if you go down this route. But there are times where people want to do it for that reason. And if it makes sense, then yes, it's completely possible. You've allowed for the movement, you've allowed for the building to do what it needs to do, and then you just, reap the repercussions of what happens. If you minimize it as much as you can for a year or 2 years or 5 years at a time until you need to go in and make it a maintenance item, then you've accomplished your goal. Couple examples. This comes from one of my trusted architects, may actually be on the call. This was a situation where they had an almost full height door frame, but it didn't go quite to the top. And then so you've got two different areas to address here. You've got what's happening with a solid sheet of drywall in what we call the pre-rock area. You look at that MMR board type product, that's that darker product that's up there in the top in the plenum area above the ceiling tile that's never going to be seen. And you've got the product down below. So you've got the visible part of this wall and you've got the invisible part of the wall. Understand that if we're talking about control joints and wanting to control cracking, we need to take that all the way up into the plenum area, because that board is also 30 feet or X longer in length. And so eventually it will crack. If you don't provide relief, if they'd have stopped this at the white board and not gone to the darker color board, eventually in that 30, 35, or in that 30, 29 to 31 foot area somewhere, there would be a crack that would show up. So they went ahead and chose to go provide relief all the way up that wall. We'll see later how they addressed that part of it. But so this is one of the situations we get questions about. Okay, how far do we have to go up the wall? Well, if it's over 30 feet, you go up the entire wall. Unless you have a crack up there and you don't care about it. Another example that I get, this is from an architectural firm that called me that said, look, we've got some subway tile. We'd like to have it uninterrupted. We've got some door trim. We'd like to have it uninterrupted. We've got a wall that's way over 30 feet. How are we going to handle this? How should we put a control joint in here? They decided what they thought about doing, what they decided to do was, in the area where the uninterrupted door trim was, they put a control joint up in that area, and they put a backer on the corner of that trim. They didn't nail that trim down at the very corners, so if that board moved a little bit, the trim wouldn't move. It moved independently in that particular area on the wood, on that door trim. That's the way they choose to deal with it. If they had chosen to put a control joint in that subway tile, they could have done basically the same thing. They could have put maybe some little sheet good or something right behind that area and allowed the board to move, because it's going to be microscopic. But you don't want to pop a tile. You don't want it, and it probably would never move enough that it would pop a tile. But in that particular case, they put like a little backer in that they could apply the tile to, a little substrate, and then they kind of skimmed over that part of it. They kind of worked through that part of it, and then there was a control joint up the middle of the rest of it. So those were the two options that they decided on. They were going to take it to their design team, their interior designer, and see what they thought, see which made the most sense for them. Again, I'm just trying to show some, yes.
There's a question.
Yes.
On the part above the ceiling, could you leave the gap if you don't need to have a continuous wall?
Yes and no. I actually, that's a good question. If you notice, there's the rest of this wall is fire taped. Okay. So in this area, yeah, this is a 1 hour rated wall. And so they were going to put down below, they were going to put a fire rated control joint in. What they chose to do was they went ahead and pre-filled that with a setting compound, and they went ahead and fire taped it so that it maintained the continuity of the fire rating that they needed without putting the true fire rated control joint in that wall. And they understood that eventually that would maybe bulge out or crack, but it was in the plenum area and it wasn't a big deal. So
Perfect.
yeah, so I actually had a slide to show that a little later, but we'll address it now since the question came in. It's an excellent question. Anything
Thanks
else?
for the thorough answer. No other questions at this point are posted.
Okay, sounds good. So let's go through a couple case studies of real world things that have happened. One of the one of the things that I love, I talked about being a drywall geek earlier in the presentation. One of the things that I love about this job that I have from a technical marketing standpoint is I get to get out on job sites in addition to talking to architects and engineers on a regular basis and helping you out with your everyday mundane things that you worry about. Okay, I need a 2-hour rated wall here, a 1-hour rated wall here. We all have that boring part of our job that we have to do. And then sometimes when we get out to the job site, things have gone awry, and that's when we get to have some fun. So while this would be a problem for most people, I saw this as a learning opportunity, and I'm going to use it to educate some of you folks here. So this is a daycare center, a wood-framed daycare center that is 96 feet from the right side of this picture to the left side of this picture, and there were no control joints put in that entire hallway. So if you look at where the two areas are that are highlighted in the yellow, that entire area, that hallway there, was 96 feet long, wood framed, not a single control joint. Now, if you look through the rest of the building, you can say, okay, well, the rest of the building, probably there's not a room in there that's over 30 feet. In those rooms themselves, we didn't need a control joint. We're fine. But somehow the design team, it kind of slipped their mind that, okay, no, 96-foot run, wood frame building, maybe we should do something about that. Just to make, while I'm on this slide, I'm just going to make a little example. Right in the middle there where it shows drywall cracking with the red angles, there's a scissor truss that sits right on top of a vaulted ceiling that sits right in the middle. They have this signature entranceway, that's welcoming for all the parents and the kids. Nice little area with some toys out for the kids to come when they're visiting when they're dropping their kids off and opening them up. They have a scissor truss right over top of there that has a vaulted ceiling with 2 skylights in it, one on each side of the building, that created a tremendous amount of stress on the drywall there. So we'll talk about it as well. We'll show an example of what that did. That was a total situation. So the reason I bring this one to the forefront of this group is when I got the phone call, they said, we have some cracking in our drywall and we need to get it fixed. We don't know what it is. So there were 2 different problems on this job site. There was the control joint issue, and I'll show you examples of that. And then where that scissor truss sat in the center, there was actually enough pressure coming down. They had their HVAC in the ceiling. I asked if I could go above. When I saw what was going on down below, I said, can I go up there? They had a walkway that went the length of the building that you could stand up in the pitched truss area. And in that area, they had all their HVAC sitting inside the building, all their mechanicals sitting inside the building, right on top of that scissor truss. And it was causing some real problems. That ended up being a structural issue that they had to worry about. I had to get a structural engineer out there. So again, hopefully this would be a tough presentation if you were not sitting at your computer. Hopefully I've drawn enough arrows in here that you can start to see a control joint that's not installed is going to create a minimal experience in a wall cavity, but it's visible when you're there. So it's a crack is nothing more than a control joint crack. More often than not is nothing more than like a little pencil line in the wall, but it goes maybe from the top of the wall. In this particular case, on the left-hand side, it goes from one side of the hallway to the other. And interestingly enough, this particular picture was started at the left-hand side there. You come in, it was about 30 feet. I'll show you some pictures on the other side that goes in from the right-hand side. It was about 31 feet. So in both cases, there were butt joints right there anyway. And so basically what it did was it started to create enough issue that it opened up those butt joints. It just created that crack because it was starting to move enough, and that was the weak link in the chain. So again, some of these pictures, depending on your screen, may be a little tough to see. But in the right-hand side, you can see this is a ceiling in a hallway. There's a light right there. There's a crack that goes from one side all the way to the other. On the left-hand side, that's a little dark picture, but there's a ceiling. That's a ceiling across a crack across the ceiling light, and then they have one coming down into one of the classrooms. Same way here. You can tell that these are different parts of the building. One was on one side of the building. This was on a different side of the building where some of the emergency lighting it was. But we had the same thing there. There's on both sides of this area, they had these cracks. In the mind of the owner, these cracks and the stress crack I'll show you shortly we're all the same thing. Our drywall is cracking. We're scared it's going to fall off the wall. That was when we were called out. That's why they felt like the drywall was inferior and that there was going to be some sort of delamination and they were going to have drywall falling on these children's heads. So again, we understand in the business typically what happens, but it's not always the case that the client is going to understand the total. This one is tough to see all the way through, but again, it's another across the ceiling. Here's the vaulted area of the ceiling. As we get closer to the middle, you can kind of see this as it comes up at an angle. This is a nice clear picture of what a control joint crack looks like. Not a huge deal, but for the owner, they're like, there's a problem with our drywall. Same way here. If you see above that light where the little blue arrow is, a little blue line is, you know, this is on one side of the wall. This is from the other side. So control joint case study. Now we have a steel framed building, a steel framed college campus where they have some signature, they have a huge building, a big entranceway. This was the best part of the entire job. Okay. Inside, this is a classroom. Inside this cylinder, inside this dome, is a screen that goes all the way around. And the little sections that you see there are not actually any kind of change. That's still a flat wall. Those are just different parts of, they have the opportunity to show multiple screens, or they can do a surround sound. They could show the Kentucky Derby and have the horses running all the way around the track, and you could follow it all the way around that. It's a fantastic space. It's a wonderful space. Just for your knowledge, around this particular area was 168 feet on the exterior of it, and they had no control joints whatsoever on the inside or the outside because the owner wanted it to aesthetically be pleasing and they didn't want to have the cracks in the screen. So hopefully you can see right here, there's a crack. If you can see my mouse, there's a crack right there. There's a crack over here coming across these. It goes, you know, and you can tell where the relief is because it started on the outside, it came through the inside, and then went right up the wall on the outside of the product.
Ouch.
Kind of scary.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So other places in the building exhibited the same issue. This is the bottom of a stairway. Right, you can see a control crack right here. There was a little change in the framing. We talked about changes in the framing. There was there's a vault here, and then we go to a flat spot. Here's a better example of what we're looking at. This is over 30 feet from the top to the line. So what you saw right here, that's the line. I didn't catch the bottom of it. It's concrete seating, so you have constant traffic up and down there. The concrete was well done. I didn't feel like there was movement there anywhere because there were plenty of joints here and there could have been issues, but the concrete showed enough support. The structural engineer did a fantastic job of designing it. The only problem that they forgot was they went past the limitations of what the drywall could actually do. I'll show you this from another example. This is a similar stairway in another part of that same floor. This one was close to the classroom area. This one was out in the more public area, but there were control joints, and I apologize, I didn't think enough to get one from the middle, but there was control joint issues there. And even though this wasn't 30 foot because the framing made a change, they had control joint issues at both of those turns. They would have had one somewhere because you were over 30 feet. As you can see, it's a beautiful space. It's well designed. It was a fantastic building. Great architect, well put together. Here's a little control joint crack in a wall. Control joints can be vertical or horizontal. Here's a little crack that happened in a wall that was over 30 feet tall. That was where the drywall decided it needed relief. Here's a couple different things. This particular area is actually a stress crack. If you look at how it comes down, it comes out of the wall, it comes down, and it comes out and makes a little jag right there. That indicates that this is a stress crack. And if I'd have been smart enough to take a picture of the entire wall, you'd have seen the fact that this was under 30 feet, but this was a stress area that was resulting from that second floor cantilever there. They were putting some undue stress on that gypsum joint. Even though it looks like a control joint crack from the standpoint of what it is. how it looks. And again, I didn't take a picture of the whole thing because I knew I was going to use this for an example and I didn't want to reveal the area of the building. All right. So this was the top of the wall. You can see this marquee right here. This was the bottom of the wall. It kind of, the stress came all the way down, which means that cantilevered area at the top was being pushed past its liability of what it should have done. That wall should have had some more structural steel to help control it. So we've talked a little bit about stress cracks and control joints. And so we'll show some other examples using these same jobs. The scissor truss that I talked to you about that was sitting in the middle of that particular building that had the vaulted ceilings. You know, you can see the skylights up here, a vaulted ceiling with a skylight on each side. This is not a control joint issue. This is a stress crack. That drywall is bulging down to the point where it actually is starting to separate. So you've got it going two different ways. And so again, this was one of the things that the owner was concerned. We're scared our drywall is going to fall on us. And when I got there and had an opportunity to be upstairs in that building, I went to them and I said, your drywall may fall, but the heating and cooling units up there are probably going to come right on top of them. Here's the other side of that. When that vaulted ceiling, you see the stress come here, and then you see this crack go two different ways. So again, this was a structural issue. The interesting thing about this particular building was this was a pilot. They're going to put 60 of these buildings across the country. This one had been up about 4 months when this happened. So thankfully they were allowed to catch it. They had two others already in design and construction, but they were allowed before they started construction on anything else to make some adjustments to beef up that scissor truss and give it some relief, put control joints in where they needed to. So sometimes things like this actually help down the road, because instead of having this problem in 60 buildings, they only had it in 3. So here's the cylindrical presentation screen. And again, what we saw was expansion joint cracks that started two different ways, because you also had a little bit of needed some perimeter relief right here as well from the height of this thing. It wasn't 30 feet tall, but there was enough weight on it. This freestanding item by itself, once it started to give away here, it actually, the control worked across and then went up. So fantastic space. I would be thrilled if I was a student to be able to have a class in there. It was a truly unique experience. We just pushed the building a little bit past the limitations of what the drywall product could do. In that same building, there's a 3-story atrium place, a 3-story atrium. You can see from kind of the background here in the picture, you can kind of see where it's at. This was well within the 30-foot of where the control joint should be needed, and we had one. So there's a control joint right here. The problem that we had was there was some stress cracks as well. So we have a control joint that's right there where it needs to be, and then we've got a stress crack. So I put the two beside each other just so you could see. The architect did everything they could do. They did everything right. But building is showing a little signs of stress. That corner bead there is being popped out because the drywall is moving up and down manner. That has nothing to do with control joints. That has to do with stress cracks. And a couple other areas. Here's one, and on the right-hand side, you're looking at what is here on the left-hand side at the top. This is at the top of a 3-story open area, and you can see there's some stress showing. And of course, by the time we got there, they thought this was a control joint issue, and they thought control joints were an issue at outside corners. And of course, I've already indicated that they're not. But this was a stress crack that was showing where there was movement there. Again, here's another good example. We talked about the difference. This was that one hallway that I showed earlier. You've got control joints where you have different areas of the wall that they've changed the framing members, but then we also have a stress crack that's coming off of those. That's not a control joint issue because your control joint is right here and it's well within the 30 feet. This part of the hallway was well within 30 feet. It was about 8 feet long before you made that turn, but there was a stress crack right there. And again, that goes back to some of the things we were seeing in the rest of the building. The building was moving, you know, This is a different area. This was a vaulted ceiling. And in this particular case, this was a different building, so I apologize if I didn't indicate that well enough. But in this particular area, this was a stress crack. You can see that it comes off at the right-hand side there, and it goes at an angle, and then it comes up to the ceiling. In this particular building, it was a wood frame building, and this crack would open up every summer and start to close. And that's a thing called truss lift, which is a totally different situation. Neither one of these vaulted areas on either side of that exit scene were 30 feet long. That ceiling was probably 15, 18 feet tall. Would have been easily, there never should have been any kind of cracking at all. It wasn't a control joint issue. It was the fact that the wood expands and contracts in the summertime and the wintertime. And so in the summer, it would be it's on enough load that it would start to rise up a little bit. And we have a thing called truss lift. If you've not heard of it, if you work in the wood building area, you can Google that and find out a little bit more about that. This is a 2-story casino project. And in this particular case, you can see that right up there at the top, where that little can light is, there's an unusual picture. And this isn't because framing changes. This is well within 30 feet. This was about a 12 by 12 space that went up 2 stories. There shouldn't be any kind of a control joint needed right here, but there was a huge crack that came there. And this again was a situation where that part of the building, this was the southwest part of the building in an area in a big city, and it was next to a river, and the building was moving a little bit. And so the drywall was telegraphing the fact that the building was moving. They originally came to us and said our drywall was defective. And so we went out and made some calls, and we talked to some people, and we looked around a little bit, and we said, no, we're fine. We've done everything we need to do. And it took about 3 months, and they came back and said, yeah, you guys aren't at fault. We have bigger issues. We got the same thing going on with the concrete, and the siding starting to open up on the outside. So again, understanding the difference between what we get when we get the phone calls, if this is a crack, this is a stress crack, or this is a drywall damage, or your drywall's falling off the wall, or people probably seldom call and say this is a control joint issue. So a couple pictures just to kind of go through the process. What's wrong in this picture? Well, as we talked about earlier, if you're going to put a control joint in, you want to put it on the jamb side. If you're only going to put one control joint in, and this is a nice long hallway that needed multiple control joints. So if you're going to put one in, you put it on the jamb side. If you look at this particular picture, you can see the jamb is over here. The door is open. You can see the jamb is over here, and they've put it on the open side. So they weren't even consistent from an architectural standpoint. They weren't consistent in the same wall. Now, again, there are suggestions that are made by the Gypsum Association, by our industry, and so we recommend 2 at each corner, 1 in each corner. And if you don't do that, you use the jamb side. I mentioned that earlier, and that's in the documents that we'll reference later. So again, this is one of those things. And then here we come back to the picture, Stacy, that you asked about. Somebody in the crowd got a little bit ahead of me, and that was perfect. This was the other side of that doorway. If you remember the other side of the doorway, you could see the door. That was the left side of the doorway. We're seeing the right side of the doorway. This design team had decided to put control joints at the top of both sides of that area. And they had already started to fire tape the part in the plenum. So what they did was they pre-filled this with a setting compound, and then they went ahead and taped over it to maintain the fire continuity instead of doing a full-blown fire-rated control joint from one side of the wall to the other, which is perfectly acceptable because on the other side, they fire taped it to maintain it as well. Understand that particular product may or may not crack out eventually. It may bulge a little bit and not crack. It may bulge and crack. It could be a maintenance item down the road. That's one of those things that they'll have to look at from a manufacturing standpoint, from a facility maintenance standpoint. But that was the way they decided to do that. And aesthetically, it was perfectly acceptable because they've met the fire rating at the top. They're going to meet the fire rating at the bottom because down below was a fire rated control joint on both sides. They just didn't extend it up into that plenum area and that cavity because of the difficulty of getting into that area. So we're coming to the end here. I'm going to have some time for questions and answers if there are any. We've talked about a lot of things. There are resources that are available to you that I will be happy to send electronically to anybody that's on this call that would wish them. I may send them out just as a follow-up anyway. But the GA 234, the Gypsum Association, has control joints for fire resistance rated systems. And so that's a document you see down there at the bottom. That's a document you could download yourself. I'd be happy to send you one. The GA 216 2021 is the Gypsum Association's kind of guideline Bible for application and finishing of gypsum panel products. There is a 2024 edition out. The 2024 edition costs money. The 2021, if you go to the Gypsum Association, you can download that one for free. I have a PDF I'll be happy to include if people feel it's necessary. And then shameless plug for my own company. National Gypsum has a thing called the Purple Book 2. There was a Purple Book 1. There's a Purple Book 2. There's examples of the correct way to construct and details for control joints in that particular assembly. And I wouldn't be surprised if most of the people on this call, since I invited many of you, already have these documents, but this one document, the Purple Book, but I will be happy to distribute a hard copy or a downloadable version to anyone who would be interested in it. And Stacy, questions?
Dad, thank you. I see no more open questions. I do see some enthusiasm for you sending out the resources. Thank you very much for offering that. They will take you up on that. I do have one question. Do control joints need to be handled differently in an impact gyp situation, impact resistant gyp situation?
Excellent question. Absolutely excellent question. And the answer is no. The thermal expansion characteristics of gypsum are consistent. And that kind of goes back to what I said earlier. I mentioned 1/2 inch, 5/8, 3/4 inch drywall. I did not include abuse and impact, so I apologize. You're exactly right. Those would still be requirements of having to have a control joint in a plane 30 feet or longer uninterrupted.
So nothing different behind the control joint to beef up the impact resistance?
No, because typically when you put a control joint in, you're going to have structural support on the back of that control joint for each open end of the flange. So there will already be a stud on each side of that area, like there'll be a 1/2 inch studs apart. So that part of the wall will actually be stronger structurally than if somebody hits, let's say they took a baseball bat and they hit in between the 24 inch or the 16 on center stud cavity. So yes, you don't need to worry about that.
Okay. That was my personal question based on some projects that we're designing right now.
Sure.
Any other questions? Feel free to unmute or nothing's posted. Lots of enthusiasm. Oh, how do we sign up for the December 10th event? Go to CSINext.org and you will be able to register. I don't know if the registration opened yet, but be on the lookout for that and you can register for one or two or one or as many as you want. Thank you. We want to see you there. And again, a lot of enthusiasm for you. And oh, wait, somebody has a question. Mark Hogg has a question. Let's see. He wants to know if I can unmute him. And I don't know if I do this.
I'm not sure that's a good idea.
I know, Mark, I don't know if we should unmute you or not. And let's see if I can figure this out real quick. I should be able to. There you go, Mark. Sorry about that. I didn't realize that you were that you had good.
No,
go ahead. There you go.
Because this is probably easier to ask Thad than it is to type it out. So, Thad, early on you mentioned about the specs, mentioning if there is no reference to control joints or the amount, that the contractor is not bound to provide any. And I question here because I've ran into this. There will be a general note on the drawings that control joints are the responsibility of the contractor. And then, like you mentioned in the specs, there won't be any mention as to quantity. What, in your opinion, what would be the correct response to the architect in that situation, asking for the assistance to determine where they would need to be? Because if it is not falling on the contractor, if it's not a design build application, the risk is on the contractor to make sure that those things are sized and installed right and in the right locations. And I've run across that on a few things where it just seems like, yeah, we need to have some control joints installed, but we really don't know where we want them. And we'll just put that off on the drywall contractor and let him deal with it.
Sure. Thank you, Mark. Good question. I'm going to give you two answers because this is an abstract world that we live in and not everybody plays by the same rules. Ultimately, if we think about code compliance, anytime there's a difference, anytime there's a conflict in code compliance, the stricter value will govern. That's just code in general. So in this particular case, the way that I would answer that is if the architect does not call out specific areas, but yet their contract documents say follow, in the resource manual, they say follow C820 and GA216, which most good architects have that in their Part 3 spec, then in my mind, as a former contractor, I understand if you've got a long uninterrupted wall, there should be a control joint there somewhere. So the first part of the answer is, for you as an owner, if you see that in contract documents, you should be going back to the architect saying, hey, where do you want these things? This is really ultimately your call, your responsibility, according to the Gypsum Association. If that gets to the point where that doesn't get done, it's kind of missed and it's omitted. This is one of those little oddball things that people don't already see. They don't see them at the right time. Then in my mind, the architect needs to understand that the contractor should do what they're supposed to do, and they will make the choice that falls to means and methods, and they will put it where they think it makes the most sense, which sometimes is not what the owner wants or the architect wants. The design team may be abhorrent as to where it's actually done, because it might be in the middle of a big wall and be at the most obvious place not to put it, but it's right at 30 feet, and the guy's going to go, okay, instead of two little ones above a door frame, I put a great big one in the middle. I'm sorry, Mr. Architect, as far as I'm concerned, that's on you because you put it in the hands of the other guy. So ultimately, the bottom line is the code requires, or the Gypsum Association requires that it's done. You sign the contract document as a contractor. I'm talking as a contractor now. You sign the contract document saying, I will adhere to the guidelines of the Gypsum Association industry in my acceptance and my application of this product. They should pick up the ball and do that. Occasionally, everybody misses it, and we get down to the point where we start to have the issues that we had here. It's like that daycare center that I showed you. The drywall people in that wood frame sometimes are not as technically astute as the steel people. They just miss the fact that it would happen. They might not even realize it in the work that they do. But ultimately, it should be the architect, and then if it's omitted there, it should fall into the control of the contractor, and they should put it at their discretion, and everybody should live with it.
Great. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Now, see, that was easy. That was easy on you.
Okay, you're good.
Okay, we are right up to the hour, and there is one final question. If anybody else has to jump off, feel free to jump off. We understand your time is valuable, and thank you for joining us. But this is a very good question that I'd like to hear the answer to, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it here live. And those that want to stick around can. The question is, for specialty wall systems such as wood slat walls applied into the gypsum walls greater than 30 feet, would the same rules apply for control joint spacing?
The answer to that is, if you've got a monolithic surface going over that wall, wallpaper is one thing, it's going to show a crack. If you've got a specialty wall system that goes over top of that, the drywall is going to crack. The building is going to show relief regardless of whether you know it's there or not. So in that particular case, if the architect wanted to omit having a control joint there because of whatever reason, or it was missed and this beautiful wood went over top of it, that microscopic movement is not going to affect the wood on top of it. So aesthetically, if a tree falls in the woods, is anybody there to hear the sound? Does it still make a sound? If there's a crack in the wall behind a beautiful piece of wood that nobody can see, does it matter? Absolutely not. Did I answer that?
I think that answers the question.
Did I understand the
I
scope of
think
the
so,
question
because
correctly?
he was asking about wood slat systems. You know how you see these wood slats? So sounds like that the gyp would be apparent, you know, behind the wood slats, but it also sounds like that they'd still have the same cracking. So if you want to avoid that and not be able to see it, then yes, go ahead and put your control joints in. That's what I'm
Well,
hearing.
at that
And
point, is the
for
gypsum, is the small part of the gypsum board crack going to be less evident than a full control joint that would show more aesthetically, have a half inch on both sides?
good point.
So yeah,
Good point. Good point.
that's a great question, right?
And
By the
for
way.
it is. And for the person that asked it, if you want to have follow-up, you see you've got Thad's information here that you can just give him a ring. Okay, we're at a little bit past stopping time. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And if you want to head over to the website and see the upcoming events, great. And we will see you on December the 10th. Have a great day.
Thank you all.